In 1920, a country was fighting for its life. Its capital was occupied, its army was scattered, its people were exhausted. But one man gathered what was left and did something nobody expected. He didn't just fight for land, he fought for something bigger. He fought for the idea that every child deserves a future. And when the war was finally over, he didn't celebrate with generals. He didn't celebrate with politicians. He gave the celebration to the children, every single child, on Earth. This is the story of April 23rd, the only national holiday in the world dedicated entirely to children, and the man who believed that a nation's future was always in its smallest hands. On this day, every child is honored. Every child is celebrated. April 23rd, a day for the children of every nation on Earth, forever and always. The year is 1919. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed. World War I is over, and the victorious powers, Britain, France, Greece, Italy, are carving up what remains of the Turkish homeland. Istanbul is occupied. The Sultan is a puppet. The army has no central command. Foreign troops are on Turkish soil. Most people believed it was over, that this ancient land, this crossroads of civilizations, would simply be divided and disappear from history. But in the mountains of Anatolia, a general refused to accept that. Mustafa Kemal gathered what remained of the resistance. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He traveled on horseback through mountains and valleys, rallying a broken people around one impossible idea. We are not finished yet. On April 23rd, 1920, in the city of Ankara, something historic happened. A new parliament opened its doors, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. Not in Istanbul, the occupied capital, but in Ankara, a small Anatolian city that nobody had considered important. Mustafa Kemal stood before the assembly and declared, "The sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation, not to a sultan, not to foreign powers, not to any single man, to the people." It was a revolutionary idea in a part of the world where kings and sultans had ruled for thousands of years, and it changed everything. April 23rd, 1920, was the day a new nation was born. Not with a treaty, not with foreign permission, with a vote.
But declaring independence and achieving it are two very different things. The next 3 years were brutal. The Turkish War of Independence was fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, against Greek forces in the west, against Armenian forces in the east, against French forces in the south. Entire villages were burned, families were torn apart, children grew up knowing only war. Through it all, Mustafa Kemal never lost sight of what he was fighting for. Not territory, not glory, a future where Turkish children would grow up free, where they would be educated, where they would lead. He said it many times, in many ways, but always the same idea. The children are our future. Without them, nothing we build will last.
By 1923, the war was won. The Treaty of Lausanne was signed. The world recognized the Republic of Turkey, a new nation, born from the ashes of an empire. Mustafa Kemal became its first president. He had achieved the impossible. A country that everyone had written off had fought its way back to life. Now came the harder work, building a modern nation from almost nothing. New laws, new alphabet, new education system, new rights for women. Everything had to change. Everything had to be built. And Mustafa Kemal, now called Atatürk, meaning father of the Turks, knew exactly where to start, with the children. The future of Turkey would be built by those who believed in it, by the children who would carry forward his vision. The nation that rose from the ashes would never fall again. In 1927, Atatürk did something extraordinary, something no leader had ever done before. He dedicated a national holiday entirely to children. April 23rd, the anniversary of the Grand Assembly, the birthday of the Republic, he gave this special day to the children, not to soldiers, not to politicians, not to himself, to every child in Turkey. And then he went even further. He said the holiday wasn't just for Turkish children, it was for all children, everywhere in the world. He personally invited children from countries around the world to come to Turkey and celebrate together. In a time when nations were building walls between each other, one visionary leader was building bridges, bridges of peace, bridges of hope, for children, for the future. April 23rd, National Children's Day, a gift from Atatürk to the children. Every year on April 23rd, something extraordinary happens in Turkey. Children take over, literally. Young students sit in the seats of parliament members. A child sits in the president's chair. Children read speeches. Children make decisions. Children run the country. For one day. Schools across the nation perform concerts and plays. Children from dozens of countries come to Turkey as guests. They wear their traditional clothes. They sing their national songs. They perform their traditional dances on Turkish stages, in Turkish cities, celebrated by Turkish people. It is the only holiday in the world where a nation hands its symbols of power to its youngest citizens, and means it.
Think about what this meant in 1927. The world was still recovering from one world war. Another was 15 years away. Nationalism was rising everywhere. Borders were hardening. Suspicion between nations was growing. And a man who had just won a brutal war of independence invited the children of his former enemies to celebrate with him. Greek children, Armenian children, French children, British children, all welcome. Ataturk understood something that most leaders still struggle with. The child standing across the border is not your enemy. They are the future, and the future is shared. UNICEF later recognized April 23rd as a model for International Children's Day. One man's gift to his nation became a gift to the world.
Ataturk didn't just give children a holiday, he spoke to them directly. He visited schools, he sat with them, he listened to them. He once said, "Everything we have done for this nation will one day be in your hands. Don't let it fall." He believed children weren't just the future of Turkey, they were the proof that the revolution had worked. A child who could read, a child who could think, a child who could question. That was his victory. Not the battles, not the borders. The child sitting in a classroom who had been given the right to imagine a different future. He visited orphans from the war. He adopted children who had lost everything. He didn't just talk about children, he showed up for them, every single time.
Every year since 1979, children from around the world have traveled to Turkey for April 23rd. They come from Japan, from Brazil, from Germany, from Nigeria, from India, from Australia. They wear their traditional clothes, they carry their flags, they sing their songs. On Turkish stages, a Japanese child performing next to a Brazilian child, next to a Nigerian child. All guests of Turkey, all celebrated equally. Parents watching from the audience see something rare. Children from countries that have complicated histories standing side by side, smiling, dancing, singing, not knowing they're supposed to be divided, because nobody told them yet. That is the power of April 23rd. It reminds us what the world looks like before we teach children to fear each other.
On April 23rd, in a parliament hall in Ankara, a child takes a seat among the nation's leaders. For one day, sovereignty belongs to them, just as it did a century ago when Atatürk planted the flag and declared that power belongs to the people. Across Turkey, children fill school auditoriums, their voices rising in song and celebration. And in the heart of Ankara, young minds from over 40 nations gather as one, a living reminder that peace is not just a dream, but a promise we make to our children. More than a century ago, Atatürk gave the world something unprecedented, a national holiday belonging entirely to children. He saw in them not just the future, but the very heartbeat of the nation itself. For on their small shoulders rests the weight of tomorrow.